What if everything you were taught about money was designed to keep you poor? What if the financial system you trust, your savings account, your retirement plan, even your education, was built on rules that stopped working decades ago? And what if right now, in this moment, you had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a second chance to rewrite your financial future before the next economic shock hits? That's exactly what Robert Kiyosaki argues in his book Second Chance, for your money, your life, and our world. And whether you agree with him or not, one thing is undeniable. The world we're living in is not the world our parents prepared us for. Today's economy rewards a new kind of thinker, someone who understands money not as a paycheck, but as a game. Someone who knows that school teaches the past, but wealth is created by people who can see the future. And according to Kiyosaki, if you don't update your mindset to match the new financial reality, you're not just falling behind, you're becoming obsolete. In this video, we're diving into the core message of the book. The past is gone, the present is unstable, the future belongs to the financially educated. Kiyosaki introduces a simple but brutal truth. The 20th century rules of money: go to school, get a job, save money, stay out of debt, no longer work in the 21st century. They were built for an economic world that died in 1971, when the US dollar stopped being backed by gold. Since then, money has been an illusion, a system that expands, inflates, and rewards people who understand debt, assets, and financial cycles. Everyone else, they get crushed. But here's the twist. Kiyosaki isn't here to scare you. He's here to show you the hidden opportunities inside the chaos. Because every financial crisis, every bubble, crash, recession, or market meltdown creates two kinds of people: those who lose everything and those who get their second chance. And that second chance comes from one thing: financial education, the kind they don't teach in school. In this summary, we're going to break down the book's most powerful ideas: how to see the invisible forces shaping the economy, why the next financial crash might be the biggest yet, and how normal people can build wealth by understanding what the rich actually do. But most importantly, we'll walk through the opposites, the new rules of money that flip traditional advice upside down. Because in a world where money is no longer real, the old strategies are no longer safe. If you want to protect your future, escape the paycheck-to-paycheck trap, and finally learn how the wealthy really think, then this is your moment. This is your second chance. Chapter 1 of Second Chance begins with one of Robert Kiyosaki's core principles. The rich don't work for money, they make money work for them. Kiyosaki revisits this foundational lesson to explain why traditional thinking about income, jobs, and financial security no longer fits the economic reality of today. The chapter opens with the contrast between his rich dad and poor dad. Poor dad represents the conventional mindset: go to school, find a stable job, work hard, and rely on a paycheck. This mindset assumes that employment is the safest path and that earning more money is the solution to financial problems. Kiyosaki argues that this belief system worked in the industrial era, but is now outdated. The economic environment has changed so drastically that following this old formula leads many people into financial struggle rather than security. Rich Dad, on the other hand, taught him that money is a tool, not the goal. Instead of chasing paychecks, rich people focus on learning how money works, how assets generate income, and how financial systems create opportunities. The central idea is that wealth is built through knowledge, not labor alone. Kiyosaki stresses that without financial education, people spend their lives working for money while remaining trapped in fear-driven decisions. Fear of losing a job, fear of not having enough, fear of taking risks. Kiyosaki explains that this fear creates what he calls the rat race. People work hard, earn money, pay bills, buy liabilities they believe are assets, and repeat the cycle indefinitely. Promotions, pay raises, and even higher degrees don't break the cycle because the underlying mindset remains the same. The absence of financial literacy causes people to react emotionally to money rather than strategically. A major focus in this chapter is the difference between assets and liabilities, a distinction Kiyosaki says schools never teach. Assets put money into your pocket, liabilities take money out. Most people misunderstand this simple definition and buy liabilities like consumer debt or an oversized house thinking they are assets. This misunderstanding feeds long-term financial instability. Kiyosaki also introduces the idea that the world changed in 1971 when the US dollar stopped being backed by gold. This event transformed money into something the government could create without limit. He highlights this shift early in the book to emphasize that understanding how modern money works is essential. Without this knowledge, individuals fall further behind as inflation and debt reshape the economy. The first chapter closes by reinforcing the mindset shift readers must adopt. Stop asking for a higher paycheck and start asking how to create or acquire assets. Kiyosaki emphasizes that financial independence requires learning, not working harder. The rich gain freedom because they understand the rules of money, and those rules reward people who think differently, act strategically, and prioritize education over wages. In short, Chapter 1 sets the foundation for the entire book. Wealth begins with financial intelligence, and the only way to escape the rat race is to learn what the rich learn, not to work like the poor work. Chapter 2 of Second Chance centers on Robert Kiyosaki's relationship with his rich dad, and how Rich Dad became a mentor who could see the future by understanding economic patterns, financial cycles, and human behavior. Kiyosaki uses this chapter to show that financial foresight is not about predicting events with certainty, but about recognizing long-term trends that most people ignore. Kiyosaki begins by describing his youth in Hawaii, where he observed two men with completely different worldviews about money. In this chapter, he focuses on how Rich Dad developed his ability to anticipate economic shifts. This skill came from analyzing how governments, banks, and corporations operate, not from reacting emotionally to markets. Rich Dad believed that the average person is financially blind because schools teach students what to think, not how to think about money. A central idea in the chapter is financial vision. According to Rich Dad, the people who succeed financially are those who read patterns the way a pilot reads instruments. They don't rely on hope or fear. They rely on data, historical context, and a clear understanding of how money actually works. Kiyosaki explains that Rich Dad studied economic cycles, booms, busts, inflation waves, and debt expansions to understand how these cycles create opportunities for those who prepare and risks for those who do not. Another key point Kiyosaki emphasizes is that Rich Dad used financial statements as tools of prediction. By analyzing income, expenses, assets, and liabilities, he could identify whether a business or individual was heading towards strength or collapse. The message is that financial statements are not just records, they are windows into the future. People who avoid learning how to read them remain dependent on paychecks and vulnerable to changes they cannot see coming. Kiyosaki then connects this idea to global events. He notes that certain large-scale changes like the U.S. dollar's shift away from the gold standard in 1971 were visible to those who understood monetary policy. Rich Dad was not surprised by growing debt levels, rising inflation, or increasing economic instability. These were predictable consequences of a currency system no longer backed by a physical asset. Kiyosaki uses this as evidence that economic futures are not random. They follow patterns created by political decisions and financial incentives. The chapter also highlights the role of education versus information. Rich Dad believed that traditional education produces workers who follow rules, while financial education produces thinkers who question rules. Because most people are conditioned to seek security rather than understanding, they become reactive rather than proactive. Kiyosaki reflects that Rich Dad's ability to see the future came from continually learning about money, taxes, banking, and investing long after school. Chapter 2 concludes by reinforcing the book's core message: the past provides clues about the future. Anyone who studies financial history, understands monetary systems, and pays attention to economic incentives can anticipate major shifts before they happen. Rich Dad taught Kiyosaki that financial freedom belongs to those who prepare, not those who predict. The goal is not to guess the future, but to recognize inevitabilities and position oneself to benefit from them, rather than be harmed by them. Chapter 3 of Second Chance addresses a common response Kiyosaki receives from readers and seminar attendees. What can I do? This question usually rises after people learn about economic instability, monetary changes, or the growing gap between the rich and everyone else. Kiyosaki uses this chapter to explain why most individuals feel powerless and what specific mindset and actions can shift them from passive observers to active participants in their financial future. He begins by analyzing the emotional cycle people experience when confronted with financial uncertainty. Many react with fear, frustration, or denial. They want solutions but hope someone else, government, employers, or financial advisors will fix their problems. Kiyosaki emphasizes that this dependency mindset is one of the biggest barriers to financial progress. The modern economic environment is too volatile to rely on the system, and individuals must take responsibility for their own education and decisions. The central argument of the chapter is that people struggle financially, not because of lack of opportunity, but because of lack of information and lack of control. Kiyosaki explains that the financial world is built on rules, written by those who understand money, banks, governments, and wealthy investors. When people do not understand these rules, they feel overwhelmed and powerless. Therefore, the first answer to what can I do is start learning the rules of money that the rich follow. Kiyosaki then introduces the idea of personal agency, the ability to influence one's financial future through deliberate choices. He contrasts two approaches: asking for guarantees, the mindset taught by the traditional education system; seeking understanding and opportunity, the mindset of financial education. He argues that school trains people to look for jobs and stability, while the real world rewards those who can think independently, evaluate risk, and identify assets. To move forward, individuals must shift from the employee mindset to what he calls the entrepreneurial or investor mindset, even if they never start a business. A key theme is the importance of taking small, practical steps rather than waiting for perfect conditions. Kiyosaki encourages readers to begin by improving their financial vocabulary, understanding assets, liabilities, debt, cash flow, taxes, and economic cycles. He stresses that learning these concepts is not optional anymore. It is a necessity in a world where central banks create money, inflation reduces purchasing power, and markets move faster than ever. The chapter also highlights the significance of mentors. Kiyosaki explains that much of what he learned came from Rich Dad, who challenged his assumptions and forced him to confront what he didn't know. He encourages readers to seek teachers who have real-world experience, not just academic knowledge, because financial success is practical, not theoretical. Kiyosaki concludes Chapter 3 by reframing the question, "What can I do?" into a more productive one. What must I learn and what actions can I take today to gain control over my financial life? The message is clear: individuals cannot change the global economy, but they can change their understanding, habits, and choices. Financial education is the starting point, and consistent practice turns knowledge into financial independence. Chapter 4 of Second Chance introduces one of Robert Kiyosaki's most provocative ideas: that modern financial systems enable a legal heist, a transfer of wealth from ordinary people to institutions that understand and control the rules of money. Kiyosaki uses this chapter to explain how economic policies, monetary decisions, and financial mechanisms quietly extract value from the general population, often without their awareness. Kiyosaki begins by redefining the concept of a heist. Traditionally, a heist refers to a robbery carried out by criminals. However, he argues that in today's economy, the largest heists are not committed with weapons, but with financial instruments, government policy, and banking systems. These are not illegal acts. They are perfectly legal and embedded into the structure of the monetary system. The victims are everyday workers and savers who believe the system is designed to protect them. A significant portion of the chapter is dedicated to explaining how money is created. Kiyosaki revisits the 1971 decision by President Nixon to remove the US dollar from the gold standard. This shift transformed money into fiat currency, meaning it is backed purely by government decree rather than a physical asset. Once money was no longer tied to gold, the supply of dollars could expand without limit. Kiyosaki argues that this change opened the door for ongoing inflation and debt accumulation, both of which quietly erode the purchasing power of ordinary people. He identifies inflation as one of the primary heist mechanisms. While inflation is often presented as a normal economic condition, Kiyosaki explains that it functions as a hidden tax. When prices rise and wages fail to keep pace, the real value of workers' earnings and savings declines. Meanwhile, those who understand how inflation works, such as investors, banks, and governments, position themselves to benefit through assets that appreciate, or through the ability to borrow money cheaply. Kiyosaki also discusses the role of banks and the fractional reserve system. Banks are allowed to lend out far more money than they hold in deposits, effectively creating money out of nothing. The system amplifies debt throughout the economy and funnels wealth toward financial institutions. According to Kiyosaki, the general public rarely understands how this works, making it easier for wealth to concentrate upward. A major argument in the chapter is that the heist is not accidental. It is a predictable outcome of a system that incentivizes debt creation. Governments borrow to fund programs, corporations borrow to expand, and individuals borrow to maintain lifestyles. This constant expansion of debt benefits those who issue and control money, while placing long-term burdens on workers who rely on wages. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the purpose of explaining this heist is not to generate fear, but to highlight the importance of financial education. People who understand how money is created, how inflation works, and how institutions gain power can protect themselves by shifting from being consumers to being asset owners. Assets in the form of real estate, businesses, commodities, or investments tend to rise with inflation, while savings and wages lose value. Chapter 4 ends with a clear message. The financial system is not neutral. It rewards those who understand it and extracts value from those who do not. Recognizing the heist is the first step toward taking control of one's financial future. Chapter 5 of Second Chance focuses on how financial crashes are not random events, but predictable outcomes of structural weaknesses in the global economic system. Kiyosaki argues that another major crash is inevitable because the underlying problems that caused past crises, excessive debt, flawed monetary policy, weak financial education, and political incentives, have never been fixed. Instead, they have intensified. Kiyosaki begins by revisiting historical crashes, such as the dot-com bubble of 2000, the housing collapse of 2008, and other periods of financial turmoil. He emphasizes that each crash followed a similar pattern: credit expansion, asset bubbles, public confidence, and then rapid collapse once leverage became unsustainable. According to him, these cycles repeat because governments and central banks consistently use short-term solutions to long-term structural issues. A major focus of the chapter is the Federal Reserve's role in shaping boom and bust cycles. Kiyosaki argues that the Federal Reserve's ability to create money and manipulate interest rates amplifies systemic risk. Low interest rates encourage excessive borrowing by consumers, corporations, and governments. When debt loads become too large, any disruption can trigger a crash. Because the U.S. dollar is a fiat currency, the government can issue limitless money. But this also pushes the system toward inflation, currency devaluation, and market distortions. Kiyosaki explains that after the 2008 financial crisis, instead of reducing risks, the system became more fragile. Quantitative easing, artificially low interest rates, and large fiscal stimulus programs stabilized the economy temporarily, but expanded debt across all sectors. He highlights that corporate debt, student loan debt, and national debt have reached unprecedented levels, creating vulnerabilities that cannot be managed forever. The more debt the system carries, the more violent the next adjustment will be. Another key point is the wealth gap created by monetary policy. Asset prices rise when money is printed, benefiting investors and institutions that own assets. Meanwhile, the majority of workers who rely on wages do not benefit from asset inflation and face rising living costs. Kiyosaki calls this trend a sign of structural imbalance that historically precedes major economic resets. The chapter also touches on the global nature of the coming crash. Kiyosaki notes that countries around the world have adopted similar monetary strategies, expanding credit and relying on central banks to stimulate growth. This interconnectedness increases contagion risk. A crisis in one major market can spread quickly across economies. He emphasizes that the next crash may be larger because the global financial system is more leveraged and more integrated than ever before. Kiyosaki stresses that predicting the exact timing of a crash is impossible, but preparing for one is essential. He identifies financial education as the most important form of preparation. People who understand money, debt, and asset cycles can position themselves to withstand downturns and potentially benefit from opportunities that arise when markets reset. Individuals who depend solely on wages and traditional retirement plans are the most exposed. Chapter 5 concludes with Kiyosaki's central warning: the system is mathematically unsustainable. Crashes are corrections created by decades of policy decisions. For those who are financially educated, the next crash can be a turning point rather than a catastrophe. The responsibility, he argues, lies with each individual to understand the risks and prepare accordingly. Chapter 6 of Second Chance focuses on the scale of the global financial system, specifically the enormous size of global debt and derivatives markets, and how these numbers reveal the structural instability of modern economies. Kiyosaki uses the concept of a quadrillion, 1,000 trillion, to illustrate how financial risks have grown far beyond the capacity of governments, central banks, or taxpayers to control. Kiyosaki begins by acknowledging that most people cannot visualize $1 trillion, much less a quadrillion. This inability to grasp large-scale numbers creates a blind spot. The public does not understand the magnitude of risk embedded in global finance. He argues that the financial elites, banks, central banks, hedge funds, and governments operate in a world measured by trillions and quadrillions, while ordinary citizens live paycheck to paycheck. This gap in scale mirrors the gap in financial education. A core theme of the chapter is the derivatives market, which Kiyosaki describes as the primary source of quadrillion-level exposure. Derivatives are financial contracts based on the value of other assets such as interest rates, commodities, stocks, or currencies. While they were originally designed to hedge risk, derivatives have evolved into highly leveraged instruments that multiply exposure across institutions. Kiyosaki explains that because derivatives are not fully regulated and often exist off the balance sheet, they can create hidden risks that only become visible during periods of financial stress. Kiyosaki connects derivatives to the 2008 financial crisis, where mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps multiplied systemic vulnerability. He argues that although regulators introduced reforms after 2008, the overall derivatives market has continued to grow. This means that the next crisis could be far larger, because the underlying numbers, especially leverage, have expanded. Another key point is the global debt burden. Kiyosaki explains that national debt, corporate debt, and consumer debt have soared worldwide, creating a system dependent on continuous borrowing. Governments issue new debt to cover old debt, corporations use borrowing to sustain stock prices, and individuals rely on credit for housing, education, and consumption. When aggregated, the global debt load reaches levels that are mathematically impossible to repay. Kiyosaki argues that this reliance on debt is a defining feature of a failing financial model. The chapter also highlights how central banks function as the backstop for systemic risk, but with limits. While central banks can print money, they cannot print trust, productivity, or stability. When financial markets operate in quadrillions while national economies operate in trillions, the mismatch becomes too large for monetary policy to fix during a crisis. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the expansion of money and debt benefits asset owners, while harming wage earners. Asset inflation in real estate, stocks, and commodities widens the wealth gap, making it harder for average people to keep up. This problem is intensified by the fact that the financial system relies on increasingly complex instruments that few people understand. The chapter concludes by reminding readers that recognizing the scale of these numbers is essential for making informed decisions. The sheer size of global liabilities suggests that the next financial reset will not be minor. For individuals, the solution is not to fear the magnitude of the system, but to strengthen personal financial intelligence, focusing on assets that hold value when currencies and debt structures come under pressure. Chapter 7 of Second Chance focuses on the concept of seeing the invisible, the ability to recognize financial forces, economic trends, and systemic risks that are not immediately visible to the average person. Kiyosaki argues that success in the modern financial world requires understanding what cannot be seen with the naked eye: debt flows, monetary policies, hidden incentives, and structural weaknesses that shape the economic landscape. Kiyosaki begins by explaining that most people only see what is directly in front of them: prices, wages, bills, and day-to-day financial pressures. Because they rely on visible signals, they often miss early warnings of economic changes. Rich Dad taught him that the most important financial information is not obvious. It exists behind the numbers inside financial statements, government policy, and institutional behavior. Learning to interpret these invisible patterns is essential for making sound financial decisions. One of the chapter's central ideas is that the financial world operates on symbols, not on physical realities. Money itself is invisible, simply numbers on screens. Backed by confidence rather than tangible assets, Kiyosaki highlights that after 1971, when the U.S. dollar became a fiat currency, money became a symbolic system that changes based on political decisions, rather than intrinsic value. The average person, unaware of this shift, continues to treat money as if it were backed by something real. Kiyosaki reinforces that seeing the invisible requires understanding financial statements. He argues that income statements, balance sheets, and cash flow reports reveal truths that news headlines do not. These documents show whether value is being created or destroyed. Rich Dad taught him that people who can read financial statements can see problems long before they appear publicly. This skill allows investors to avoid dangerous opportunities and recognize undervalued ones. Another invisible force highlighted in the chapter is taxation. Kiyosaki explains that taxes influence behavior more than most people realize. Tax codes reward certain activities such as investing, borrowing, or building businesses, while penalizing others like earning wages. The tax system, although written in public documents, is invisible to most workers because they never study it. As a result, they operate inside a disadvantageous structure without understanding why they fall behind. Financially, Kiyosaki also emphasizes institutional incentives as a key invisible driver. Governments need inflation to reduce the real value of their debts. Corporations use debt to boost stock prices and executive bonuses. Banks profit from lending more money. These incentives shape financial behavior on a large scale, yet they remain hidden to people who only view the economy through their personal expenses. Understanding these incentives helps individuals anticipate major trends and avoid being harmed by policy decisions. The chapter also explains that the ability to see the invisible comes from financial education and long-term thinking. People who study history can identify recurring patterns such as inflation cycles, currency devaluations, and asset bubbles. These patterns may not be visible in daily life, but they determine long-term economic outcomes. Chapter 7 concludes with a key message: the world's most powerful financial forces are hidden in plain sight, but only visible to those who know how to interpret them. Kiyosaki argues that developing this skill is no longer optional. In an economy shaped by debt expansion, fiat money, and rapid change, individuals must learn to see beyond appearances to protect their financial future. Chapter 8, Before and After, marks the transition point in Second Chance, where Kiyosaki shifts from analyzing the past to examining the present economic environment. The chapter's core argument is that financial change is not theoretical, it has already happened. Most people simply have not recognized the shift. Kiyosaki explains that to make effective financial decisions today, individuals must understand the difference between the world before key economic turning points and the world after them. Kiyosaki begins with a foundational distinction: the industrial age mindset, vis the information age reality. The old before world rewarded job security, long-term employment, pensions, and saving money. This system worked when money was stable, inflation was low, and companies provided lifetime benefits. In contrast, the afterworld post-1971, post-globalization, and post-financialization rewards financial skills, adaptability, and control over assets rather than reliance on employers. A major event highlighted in the chapter is the end of the gold standard in 1971. Kiyosaki repeats that this moment marks the line between before and after. Before 1971, money was tied to a physical asset. After 1971, money became debt. This shift altered everything from banking policy to personal finances. Inflation, volatility, and government intervention became permanent features of the economy. According to Kiyosaki, individuals who still live by pre-1971 rules such as saving cash and avoiding debt operate at a disadvantage in today's system. Another important before and after event discussed is the 2008 financial crisis. Before 2008, the global economy operated under assumptions of self-correcting markets and manageable debt levels. After 2008, central banks became permanent actors in financial markets through quantitative easing, low interest rates, and massive liquidity injections. Kiyosaki explains that these policies distort market signals and accelerate wealth inequality. The people who understand these structural changes adapt. Those who don't rely on outdated strategies. Kiyosaki emphasizes that financial education must evolve with these shifts. Traditional schooling prepares people for a world that no longer exists. Schools teach students to become employees who depend on salaries. However, in the afterworld, salaries lose purchasing power, job security declines, and technological automation replaces tasks once performed by humans. To succeed, individuals must understand modern money, markets, and taxes subjects excluded from most formal education systems. A key idea in the chapter is that after-thinking requires new financial strategies. Kiyosaki argues that assets such as real estate, commodities, and businesses respond positively to the realities of the modern economy, including inflation and currency expansion. By contrast, conventional retirement vehicles and savings accounts respond negatively, as they lose value in inflationary environments and expose individuals to market fluctuations they don't understand. Kiyosaki also uses the chapter to reinforce the importance of personal responsibility. In the before world, systems protected workers. In the after world, those systems have eroded. Government safety nets are strained, pensions are underfunded, and healthcare costs continue to rise. Individuals who do not adjust their thinking may face financial vulnerability. The chapter concludes by reminding readers that recognizing before and after shifts is critical. The world has changed permanently, and financial security belongs to those who change with it. Understanding the difference between old rules and new realities is the foundation. For the rest of the book, Chapter 9 marks the beginning of Part 3, where Kiyosaki introduces the opposites, principles that challenge traditional beliefs taught in school. In this chapter, he focuses on the first opposite, the opposite of go to school. This does not mean rejecting education instead. It means recognizing that the type of education needed for financial success is fundamentally different from the academic model taught in traditional schools. Kiyosaki starts the chapter by addressing a misconception. Most people believe that formal education prepares individuals for real-world financial challenges. He argues that this belief made sense in the industrial age, when the economy relied on stable corporations, government jobs, and predictable career paths. Academic success translated into job security, however. In the information age, and especially in today's globalized, technology-driven economy, this model no longer applies. The central theme of the chapter is the difference between school education and financial education. Traditional schooling emphasizes memorization, standardized testing, and specialization in subjects that do not translate into financial competence. Students graduate with degrees, but lack the ability to manage money, understand assets, evaluate risk, or navigate the modern economy. Kiyosaki states plainly, Schools prepare people to become employees, not financially independent individuals. He emphasizes that the principle "go to school" is based on three assumptions. A job will provide lifelong income security. Saving money will preserve wealth. A diploma guarantees upward mobility. Kiyosaki argues that all three assumptions are outdated. Jobs are increasingly unstable due to technology and automation. Savings lose value because of inflation and currency expansion. Diplomas no longer guarantee financial success. These shifts illustrate why simply going to school is not enough for financial survival. Kiyosaki contrasts the school system with the kind of education practiced by the wealthy. Financial education involves learning how money works, how markets function, how taxes influence behavior, and how to use debt strategically. It also involves developing emotional intelligence, the ability to manage fear, uncertainty, and risk. None of these skills are taught in traditional institutions, yet they determine long-term financial success. The chapter also discusses entrepreneurship. Kiyosaki explains that the opposite of go to school is not drop out, but learn to think like an entrepreneur or investor, even if one chooses to remain employed. Entrepreneurial thinking focuses on value creation, problem solving, and opportunity recognition, skills schools rarely teach. Kiyosaki writes that those who master entrepreneurial thinking gain control over their financial destiny, whereas those who rely solely on academic credentials remain dependent on external systems. Another key point is that financial education must be ongoing. Unlike school, which ends at graduation, real financial learning continues throughout life. Markets change, tax laws evolve, and economic cycles shift. Individuals who stop learning fall behind. Kiyosaki stresses that self-education, through books, mentors, courses, and real-world experience, is the modern path to financial resilience. Chapter 9 ends with a clear message. The world today rewards people who learn outside the traditional system. Go to school may prepare someone for the past, but financial education prepares them for the future. The opposite of the old advice is not anti-education. It is choosing the right kind of education, one that builds financial intelligence. Chapter 10 addresses one of the most deeply rooted messages taught in traditional education. Don't make mistakes. Kiyosaki argues that this mindset, while useful in academic environments, becomes a major obstacle in the real world, especially in finance and entrepreneurship. The chapter explains why avoiding mistakes prevents growth, limits financial intelligence, and keeps people stuck in a system designed for conformity rather than independence. Kiyosaki begins by contrasting the school system with real-world learning. In school, mistakes lead to punishment, lower grades, failure, or disciplinary action. Because of this, students develop a fear of being wrong over time. This fear becomes a core part of their decision-making. They seek safety, avoid risk, and choose predictable paths. Kiyosaki asserts that this conditioning produces employees, not innovators. It trains people to follow instructions instead of developing problem-solving abilities. The chapter's central point is that mistakes are essential for financial education. Unlike school, the real world operates through trial, error, and adaptation. Entrepreneurs, investors, and financially successful individuals learn by doing. They acquire knowledge through failures, market corrections, and feedback loops that cannot be replicated in a classroom. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the ability to make mistakes and learn from them is what separates financially independent people from those who remain dependent on job security. Kiyosaki explains that fear of mistakes leads to risk avoidance, which has several consequences. People rely on salaries instead of creating assets. They avoid investments because they fear losing money. They depend on retirement plans managed by others. They fail to develop personal financial literacy. By rejecting mistakes, individuals reject the very experiences that build resilience and competence. Another critical theme in this chapter is emotional intelligence. Kiyosaki states that financial success requires managing emotions, especially fear, frustration, and uncertainty. People who fear mistakes often make emotional decisions, avoiding opportunities, selling too early, or clinging to safe but unproductive financial habits. Rich Dad taught him that emotional discipline is more important than academic intelligence. When dealing with money, Kiyosaki also highlights the role of real-world practice. He argues that financial education is not theoretical. It requires hands-on experience investing, building businesses, analyzing cash flow, and learning from outcomes. This practice-based learning naturally includes mistakes, and each mistake reveals information about markets, timing, leverage, and risk. Without these experiences, individuals remain spectators rather than participants in the financial system. The chapter also addresses the cultural and social pressures around mistakes. Many people avoid trying new things because they fear judgment from family or peers. Kiyosaki warns that the social fear reinforces financial stagnation. He encourages readers to separate their identity from their failures and view mistakes as data, rather than personal flaws. Toward the end of the chapter, Kiyosaki reframes mistakes as assets. Every mistake made in pursuit of financial education increases competence and confidence. By contrast, avoiding mistakes keeps a person dependent on external systems, employers, and financial advisors. The goal is to convert mistakes into lessons, and lessons into financial intelligence. Chapter 10 concludes by stating that in the information age, where conditions change rapidly, the ability to learn through action is more valuable than academic perfection. The opposite of don't make mistakes is make mistakes, reflect on them, and grow. This mindset is essential for building real-world financial skills and long-term independence. Chapter 11 examines another core belief reinforced by traditional education: get good grades. Kiyosaki argues that this principle, while useful within the academic system, fails to prepare individuals for the realities of the financial world. The chapter explores why academic performance does not translate into financial competence, and why focusing on grades can limit a person's ability to build wealth. Kiyosaki begins by questioning the purpose of grades. In school, grades are used to evaluate memory, test performance, and the ability to follow instructions. Students who excel in these areas are praised and labeled smart, while those who struggle are often discouraged. Kiyosaki asserts that the system trains people to pursue external validation rather than developing practical skills. He notes that many academically successful individuals lack confidence in making financial decisions because they fear being wrong. The central theme of the chapter is that financial success requires skills that cannot be measured by grades: creativity, critical thinking, resilience, communication, leadership, and the ability to manage money. School rewards accuracy and conformity. The real world rewards innovation and problem solving. According to Kiyosaki, this mismatch explains why many high-performing students eventually work for entrepreneurs who did poorly in school. Kiyosaki emphasizes that academic intelligence is only one form of intelligence. Rich Dad taught him to value financial intelligence, which includes understanding cash flow, assets, debt, taxes, and market cycles. These subjects are absent from the school curriculum, so students graduate with diplomas, but without the knowledge needed to navigate the financial system. Kiyosaki argues that society overvalues academic achievement and undervalues practical financial literacy. Another key point is the fear-based mindset created by the pursuit of good grades. Students learn to avoid failure, avoid risk, and avoid situations where they might perform poorly. This mindset carries into adulthood and shapes financial behavior. People who are conditioned to fear mistakes tend to avoid investments, entrepreneurship, and opportunities that require uncertainty. Kiyosaki states that this fear limits financial growth far more than lack of money. The chapter also critiques the idea that good grades lead to good jobs. Kiyosaki explains that the modern economy no longer guarantees stability for high achievers. Technological change, globalization, and automation disrupt industries faster than academic systems can adapt. A degree may provide credentials, but it does not provide the financial skills needed to thrive in unpredictable environments. Kiyosaki additionally connects the grade-based system to employee conditioning. Schools produce people who seek approval from authority figures, teachers, bosses, institutions. This mindset encourages dependence on employers, retirement plans, and financial advisors. In contrast, financially successful individuals take responsibility for their own decisions. learn independently, and question conventional advice. Toward the end of the chapter, Kiyosaki reframes the opposite of get good grades as focus on gaining real-world financial skills. This does not mean ignoring education. It means prioritizing the kind of learning that leads to independence, lifelong learning, mentorship, investing experience, and financial literacy matter far more than academic transcripts. Chapter 11 concludes with a reminder: grades measure performance within a controlled system, but life operates outside that system. Financial freedom requires education, but the right kind, one centered on competence, not compliance. Chapter 12 challenges another long-held belief promoted by traditional education and culture: get a good job. Kiyosaki argues that while this advice once made sense in the industrial age, it is no longer an effective financial strategy in the modern, debt-driven global economy. The chapter explains why relying on employment as a primary source of income limits financial growth and exposes individuals to risks they may not recognize. Kiyosaki begins by exploring the assumptions behind the phrase "get a good job." Historically, a good job meant stable income, benefits, medical coverage, and a pension. The system was supported by large corporations and government institutions. During an era of economic expansion and limited global competition, workers exchanged loyalty for security. But Kiyosaki states that this model collapsed decades ago. Today, corporations reduce costs through automation, outsourcing, and technology, while pensions and long-term benefits have largely disappeared. The central argument of the chapter is that a job is no longer a path to financial independence. A job provides income, but not assets. Income is taxed heavily and disappears quickly through expenses. Assets generate cash flow, grow in value, and benefit from tax incentives. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the rich focus on assets first, while employees focus on wages. Because employees lack financial education, they often mistake income for wealth. Kiyosaki highlights the lack of control that comes with employment. Employees depend on employers for raises, promotions, and job security. They cannot control market conditions, corporate decisions, or economic cycles. During recessions or technological shifts, employees are the first to experience layoffs. Kiyosaki argues that relying on a job creates long-term vulnerability because the individual does not own the source of their income. Another important point is the tax disadvantage of employment income. Kiyosaki explains that employees typically pay the highest tax rates, while business owners and investors benefit from deductions, incentives, and legal structures that reduce their tax burden. This structural disadvantage makes it difficult for employees to accumulate wealth, regardless of how hard they work or how high their salary becomes. Kiyosaki also introduces the difference between job security and financial security. Job security depends on someone else. Financial security depends on assets and financial intelligence. Many people cling to jobs because they fear uncertainty. Yet this emotional reliance prevents them from developing asset-based income streams. Kiyosaki argues that the modern economy favors those who can adapt, innovate, and create value, traits rarely developed within traditional employment. The chapter emphasizes that the opposite of get a good job is not to quit working immediately or reject employment altogether. Instead, it means understanding that a job should be a stepping stone, not a destination. Individuals should use their job income to build assets, acquire financial skills, and eventually reduce their dependence on a paycheck. Kiyosaki concludes Chapter 12 by reinforcing the importance of shifting from the employee mindset to the entrepreneur or investor mindset. Employees seek stability. Entrepreneurs and investors seek opportunity. The modern financial environment rewards those who learn to generate income through assets, not those who rely solely on wages. The real path to long-term financial resilience begins when individuals stop depending on a job and start building systems that can create income independently. Chapter 13 challenges one of the most deeply ingrained financial rules taught by families, schools, and traditional advisors: get out of debt. Kiyosaki argues that while this advice applies to certain types of debt, it is incomplete and in today's economic system, potentially harmful. Instead of avoiding debt entirely, Financially educated individuals learn to differentiate between good debt and bad debt, and use good debt strategically to build wealth. Kiyosaki begins by explaining why the traditional mindset views all debt as dangerous. For most people, debt is used to buy liabilities, consumer goods, cars, and homes that do not generate income. When people borrow to fund consumption, they become financially weaker, as more of their income is consumed by interest payments. This is bad debt, debt that takes money out of your pocket. Kiyosaki agrees that people should avoid this type of debt. However, he argues that the blanket rule, get out of debt, ignores how the modern financial system works. Since 1971, when money became fiat currency, the economy has been driven by debt expansion. Governments, corporations, and financial institutions rely on debt to fuel growth. Those who understand the system use debt as a tool. Those who don't become victims of it. According to Kiyosaki, the wealthy do not fear debt. They fear not knowing how to use it. A central focus of the chapter is the concept of good debt, borrowing money to acquire assets that generate cash flow. Examples include investment real estate, business financing, and acquiring income-producing systems. Good debt allows investors to control larger assets with smaller amounts of their own money, magnifying returns and building passive income streams. Kiyosaki highlights that banks reward this behavior by offering favorable terms to borrowers who understand cash flow and asset value. Kiyosaki also explains the tax advantages tied to good debt. In many countries, interest payments on investment loans are tax-deductible, reducing taxable income. Additionally, income-producing assets can provide depreciation benefits, which further reduce tax burden. Employees who avoid debt often miss these advantages because they rely solely on earned income, the most heavily taxed income type. The chapter critiques the traditional financial advisors who promote zero debt as the safest path. Kiyosaki argues that this advice may protect people who lack financial discipline, but it does not help those who want financial independence. In an inflationary world, cash loses value over time. Debt tied to income-producing assets becomes more manageable as inflation erodes the value of repayment dollars. This dynamic benefits borrowers and asset owners, not savers. Another important point is that avoiding all debt limits growth. Without leverage, individuals rely only on their own income and savings to acquire assets, which slows wealth creation. Kiyosaki emphasizes that people must learn how debt works so they can use it responsibly and strategically. The problem is not debt itself, it is ignorance about debt. Chapter 13 concludes by reframing the old rule. The opposite of get out of debt is learn to use debt wisely to acquire assets. Bad debt reduces financial strength, but good debt increases it. Financial freedom requires understanding the difference and using the financial system to your advantage, not avoiding it out of fear. Chapter 14 challenges another conventional financial principle widely taught by families and traditional financial advisors: live below your means. While this advice appears responsible, Kiyosaki argues that it can limit a person's financial growth and reinforce a mindset of scarcity. In a world driven by inflation, debt expansion, and rapidly rising costs, simply cutting expenses is not a viable long-term strategy for achieving financial freedom. Kiyosaki begins by explaining the logic behind the traditional advice. For many individuals who lack financial discipline, reducing spending is essential to avoid debt traps and maintain basic financial stability. However, he argues that living below your means creates psychological constraints. It teaches people to shrink their lifestyle to match their income instead of expanding their income to achieve the lifestyle and financial independence they desire. The central theme of this chapter is the difference between expense reduction and income expansion. Schools train people to manage scarcity, find a job, budget carefully, and save what little remains. This mindset aligns with the industrial age economy, where wages were stable and inflation was minimal. In today's economy, wages often fail to keep pace with rising prices, meaning that cutting expenses cannot keep up with systemic financial pressures. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the wealthy take the opposite approach. Instead of focusing on reducing expenses, they focus on increasing assets that create income. When income grows through cash-flowing assets, such as real estate, businesses, or investments, the need to restrict spending diminishes. Wealthy individuals do not rely on budgeting to stay afloat. They rely on asset growth to expand their financial means. A key point in the chapter is the impact of inflation on the live below your means mindset. Inflation steadily erodes the purchasing power of saved money. People who follow traditional advice by saving aggressively and cutting expenses often watch the value of their savings decline. Meanwhile, individuals who invest in assets tend to see their wealth grow as asset values rise with inflation. Kiyosaki argues that focusing on savings and frugality locks a person into a losing strategy. In an inflationary environment, the chapter also highlights how traditional advice can trap people in the employee mindset. When individuals focus solely on budgeting, they become risk-averse and reluctant to pursue opportunities that require investment or learning. Kiyosaki states that financial growth comes from building assets, taking calculated risks, and increasing financial intelligence, all actions that contradict a scarcity mindset. Kiyosaki clarifies that he is not promoting irresponsible spending. Rather, he argues that people should shift their energy from cutting costs to building capacity. This includes improving financial education, acquiring entrepreneurial skills, learning to use debt strategically, and creating multiple streams of income. The true opposite of live below your means is expand your means through asset creation. Another important point is the role of confidence and mindset. People who believe they must restrict themselves often never pursue financial opportunities. In contrast, individuals who believe they can expand their means act more boldly and develop skills that increase their long-term earning capacity. Chapter 14 concludes with the core message: financial freedom is not achieved through restriction, but through expansion. Instead of shrinking one's lifestyle to fit a paycheck, individuals should grow their financial intelligence and assets until their means far exceed their needs. This shift from scarcity to abundance is essential for thriving in the modern economic system. Chapter 15 explores a controversial idea, the opposite of don't cheat. Kiyosaki does not advocate cheating. He argues that the financial system itself is structured in ways that many people would consider unfair, and those who do not understand these rules often feel as though they are being cheated. His main point is that the wealthy are not cheating, they are simply using legal tools, incentives, and systems that the financially uneducated rarely understand. Kiyosaki starts by explaining that the statement "don't cheat" is rooted in moral education. Designed for children, parents and schools teach it to promote honesty and discipline. In personal ethics, this rule is essential. However, Kiyosaki shifts the discussion to the financial world, where the rules are far more complex. In finance, what appears to be cheating is often simply knowledge applied strategically. A core theme in this chapter is the difference between perception and reality. Many people believe the rich get ahead unfairly because they exploit loopholes or manipulate the system. Kiyosaki argues that the wealthy operate within the law but understand how the system is designed to reward specific financial behaviors, especially investing, building businesses, hiring employees, and using debt. These behaviors contribute to economic growth, so governments incentivize them through tax benefits and favorable regulations. Kiyosaki stresses that tax laws are not designed to punish everyone equally. They are written to encourage certain activities. Employees pay the highest taxes because the system is structured to tax earned income. Investors and business owners legally reduce taxes through deductions, depreciation, incentives, and corporate structures. This difference is not cheating. It is a reward for participating in the parts of the economy that generate jobs and growth. He argues that people who don't understand these rules feel cheated because they are operating from limited financial knowledge. The solution, he says, is not to be angry at the system, but to learn the rules of the system so they can benefit from them. Financial education transforms what appears to be unfair into a set of opportunities that anyone can access with the right knowledge. Another major point in the chapter is that financial systems are inherently asymmetric. Banks use fractional reserve lending to create money. Governments borrow without limits. Corporations use debt to scale. Investors leverage capital to multiply returns. Ordinary individuals, lacking financial literacy, misinterpret these practices as unethical. Kiyosaki argues that these mechanisms only seem unfair because people are unaware of how money truly works. The chapter emphasizes the importance of playing by the rules, but playing smart. Kiyosaki insists that ethical conduct is essential, but ethical conduct does not mean remaining uninformed or passive. It means taking responsibility for gaining financial intelligence so that one can legally and effectively navigate the system. Kiyosaki concludes Chapter 15 with a clear message. The opposite of don't cheat is learn the rules of the financial game so you can play it legally, ethically, and successfully. In today's complex economy, ignorance feels like being cheated. Knowledge restores fairness and creates opportunity. Chapter 16 addresses the widespread belief that the rich are greedy. Kiyosaki argues that this belief is not only inaccurate in many cases, but also financially damaging for those who cling to it. The chapter explains how negative assumptions about wealth create mental barriers that prevent individuals from learning, investing, or building assets. Instead of viewing wealth as a sign of greed, Kiyosaki suggests understanding how wealth is created and why that understanding is essential. In today's economy, Kiyosaki begins by exploring the emotional and cultural roots of the belief. Many people grow up hearing that wealthy individuals exploit others, hoard resources, or act selfishly. These messages create resentment toward wealth and admiration for modest living. However, Kiyosaki argues that these attitudes often come from people who lack financial education and do not understand how wealth is built. This resentment discourages individuals from seeking financial growth because people rarely pursue something they believe is immoral. A central theme in the chapter is that wealth creation is tied to problem solving, not greed. Entrepreneurs and investors succeed because they identify needs, create value, and take risks that others avoid. The market rewards solutions, not intentions. Kiyosaki clarifies that while unethical wealthy individuals exist, unethical behavior is not limited to any income group. Greed can be found among the poor, middle class, and rich alike. Wealth is not the cause of greed, character is. Kiyosaki then contrasts productive wealth with consumptive wealth. Productive wealth creates jobs, innovations, and economic expansion. Many wealthy people reinvest earnings into businesses, real estate, or investments that benefit the broader economy. In contrast, individuals who lack financial education often use money for consumption, not investment. This difference in how money is used, not the amount, determines long-term financial outcomes. Another major point in the chapter is that misunderstanding wealth leads to self-sabotage. People who believe the rich are greedy often resist investing, avoid business opportunities, or criticize financial success. This mentality keeps them trapped in the employee mindset, reliant on wages, and disconnected from the mechanisms of asset creation. Kiyosaki stresses that changing one's mindset toward wealth is a necessary precursor to building assets. Kiyosaki also explains the importance of financial responsibility. Wealthy individuals must manage cash flow, taxes, debt, employees, and risk. These responsibilities require discipline and continuous learning. This level of responsibility is the opposite of greed. It is structured, strategic effort. By contrast, he argues that many people who accuse the rich of greed misunderstand the complexity and risk inherent in building and maintaining wealth. The chapter highlights how governments incentivize wealth-building behaviors through tax policies. These incentives exist not to reward greed, but to stimulate economic activity. Investors and business owners receive tax advantages because they contribute to productive sectors of the economy. Employees rarely receive such benefits because wages do not create additional economic expansion. Kiyosaki reframes this not as unfair favoritism, but as a set of rules anyone can learn and apply. Chapter 16 concludes with the central message. The opposite of the rich are greedy is wealth can be a tool for value creation. Understanding this distinction allows individuals to adopt a healthy mindset toward money, pursue financial education, and engage in wealth-building activities without guilt or hesitation. The problem is not wealth itself, it is misunderstanding what wealth represents. Chapter 17 challenges another common belief learned from parents, schools, and traditional financial advisors: investing is risky. Kiyosaki argues that this belief stems from a lack of financial education, rather than from investing itself. The core message of the chapter is that ignorance is risky, informed investing is not. When people do not understand how money, markets, and assets work, everything looks dangerous. When they gain financial intelligence, opportunities become clearer and risks become manageable. Kiyosaki begins by explaining why most people fear investing. In school, students are not taught about money, cash flow, or market behavior. As adults, they depend on financial advisors, employers, or retirement plans to handle investing for them. This dependence reinforces the belief that investing is too complicated or unpredictable for the average person. Because individuals have little personal experience or knowledge, they interpret any uncertainty as risk. A central theme in the chapter is that lack of control creates fear. Employees have no control over company decisions, layoffs, or wage stagnation. Savers have no control over inflation or currency devaluation. Traditional retirement accounts often lock individuals into volatile markets without education. Kiyosaki argues that real risk lies in not understanding the environment in which your money exists. He introduces the concept of an investor's foundation. The foundation includes financial education, practical experience, understanding of financial statements, awareness of market cycles, and the ability to evaluate assets. When this foundation is strong, investing becomes less about speculation and more about informed judgment. People with strong foundations reduce risk through knowledge, not through avoidance. Another major point is the difference between good investing and gambling. Many people engage in the latter without realizing it. They buy stocks they do not understand, invest based on tips, or follow trends without analyzing fundamentals. When these decisions fail, they conclude that investing is inherently risky. Kiyosaki argues that the wealthy invest strategically. They study markets, assess cash flow, use debt intelligently, and look for long-term value rather than short-term excitement. Kiyosaki also emphasizes the importance of control in reducing risk. Investors increase control by acquiring knowledge, conducting due diligence, understanding tax laws, and using proper financial structures such as corporations or LLCs. Control also comes from choosing investments that align with one's experience and strengths. The more control an investor has, the lower the risk, even if the investment appears risky to outsiders. The chapter addresses the role of financial education in risk management. Schools rarely teach subjects such as leverage, taxes, market cycles, or the differences between asset classes. As a result, many people fear investing simply because they don't know enough to evaluate opportunities. Kiyosaki argues that education reduces fear and transforms perceived risk into strategic decision-making. Kiyosaki concludes Chapter 17 with a clear message. The opposite of investing is risky is not investing is risky. Relying solely on wages, savings, and traditional retirement plans exposes individuals to inflation, job loss, and economic cycles they cannot control. In contrast, informed investing provides income streams, tax advantages, and long-term financial security. The key to lowering risk is increasing intelligence, not avoiding opportunities. Chapter 18 challenges one of the most deeply ingrained pieces of financial advice taught worldwide: save money. Kiyosaki argues that in the modern economic system built on fiat currency, inflation, and expansive monetary policy, saving money is not a wealth-building strategy. Instead, it exposes individuals to long-term financial erosion. The chapter explains why the advice made sense decades ago, but is no longer effective, and why financially educated people take the opposite approach. Kiyosaki begins by addressing the historical context. Before 1971, when the US dollar was backed by gold, saving money preserved purchasing power. The currency was stable, inflation was low, and banks paid meaningful interest on deposits. In that environment, saving money was logical. But after the gold standard ended, money became debt-based, and governments could create it freely. This shift fundamentally changed the purpose and behavior of money. The central theme in the chapter is that inflation destroys the value of savings. When central banks increase the money supply, prices rise. The dollars held in savings accounts lose purchasing power each year. Kiyosaki highlights that most savers do not realize they are losing money slowly over time. Meanwhile, banks lend out savers deposits at higher interest rates, generating profit from the very money that savers believe is secure. Another key point is the interest rate problem. In modern economies, interest rates on savings accounts rarely outpace inflation. This means that even disciplined savers fall behind financially. Kiyosaki argues that the system is designed this way intentionally. Inflation encourages spending and borrowing, which fuels economic growth. Savings, on the other hand, sit idle and do not stimulate economic activity. Therefore, policies rarely reward saving. Kiyosaki contrasts savers with investors. While savers lose purchasing power, investors acquire assets that rise with inflation, such as real estate, commodities, businesses, and certain financial instruments. Assets not only protect value but often increase it, especially when purchased with good debt. As inflation rises, asset prices tend to rise as well, giving investors a significant advantage over those relying on cash reserves. The chapter also addresses the psychological side of saving. Many people save money because they believe it is the safest option. Kiyosaki argues that this belief comes from a lack of financial education. Safety in the financial world is not determined by the absence of movement, but by understanding how money behaves. In an inflationary environment, cash is risky, not safe. Kiyosaki emphasizes that clinging to savings is often a sign of fear-driven decision-making. Kiyosaki then explains how governments and banks benefit from savers. Banks use deposits to create loans through fractional reserve banking, multiplying money supply and earning interest. Governments rely on inflation to reduce the real burden of national debt. In both cases, savers unintentionally subsidize the financial system by holding onto depreciating currency. The opposite of save money, he argues, is convert money into assets. This does not mean abandoning all cash. Individuals still need liquidity for short-term needs. However, long-term wealth requires moving money into vehicles that grow, generate income, and offer protection against inflation. Chapter 18 concludes with the message that saving money worked in the past, but not in the modern economic reality. Financial independence requires asset accumulation, not accumulation of cash. Understanding this shift is a crucial component of financial intelligence. Chapter 19 closes the opposite section by reframing another widely accepted belief. An emergency is bad. Kiyosaki argues that while emergencies can be painful and disruptive, they also create unique opportunities for those who are financially educated and emotionally prepared. Instead of seeing emergencies only as threats, the wealthy view them as catalysts for growth, learning, and strategic advantage. Kiyosaki begins by redefining what an economic emergency actually is. Emergencies, including recessions, market crashes, currency devaluations, and financial shocks, are natural parts of economic cycles. They are not random accidents. They reflect the underlying weaknesses in financial systems built on debt and expansion. Because crises are predictable, they should not come as a surprise. The only people caught off guard are those who ignore financial patterns. A core theme in the chapter is the difference between reaction and preparation. Most individuals respond to emergencies emotionally. They panic, sell assets at losses, rely on government assistance, or retreat into fear-based decision-making. This reaction comes from lack of financial education. In contrast, individuals with financial intelligence anticipate emergencies and position themselves so that they are not only protected but also able to capitalize on opportunities that arise during disruptions. Kiyosaki highlights that emergencies often accelerate wealth transfer. During downturns, the financially unprepared liquidate assets to survive, while financially educated investors acquire those assets at discounted prices. This pattern has repeated across major crises, including the 1987 crash, the 2000 dot-com bust, and the 2008 housing collapse. Each event shifted wealth from those who panicked to those who understood cycles and maintained cash flow. The chapter emphasizes the importance of liquidity and cash flow during emergencies. While Kiyosaki criticizes saving money as a wealth-building strategy, he acknowledges that maintaining liquidity for strategic purposes is essential. The difference is intention. Savers hold cash for security, whereas investors maintain liquidity to seize opportunities when markets reset. This approach transforms emergencies from setbacks into leverage points. Another major point in the chapter is emotional discipline. Crises test a person's mindset more than their bank account. Fear-driven behavior leads to poor decisions, while calm, informed decision-making allows individuals to assess risks and identify openings. Kiyosaki argues that emotional intelligence is a core part of financial IQ, especially during emergencies. Kiyosaki also explains that emergencies often reveal structural flaws in one's financial foundation. For example, excessive consumer debt becomes unmanageable during recessions. Lack of cash flow becomes dangerous when job security disappears. Individuals who rely solely on wages face severe vulnerability during downturns. Emergencies expose weaknesses that remained invisible during stable periods. For Kiyosaki, this exposure is not negative, it is valuable feedback that guides future improvements. The chapter also reframes emergencies as transition points. Economic shocks often mark the end of outdated systems and the beginning of new opportunities. Technological shifts, monetary policy changes, and market resets create openings for those who adapt early. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the information age rewards individuals who see beyond the crisis to the emerging landscape. Chapter 19 concludes with the core message: the opposite of an emergency is bad. An emergency is an opportunity for those who are prepared. Crises are inevitable, but their impact depends on one's financial intelligence, mindset, and ability to act strategically. Rather than fearing emergencies, individuals should build resilience, develop financial skills, and position themselves to benefit from the reset they create. Second Chance delivers Robert Kiyosaki's central argument. The financial world has changed permanently, and the rules most people still follow are outdated. The book explains how the shift from the gold standard, the rise of debt-based money, technological disruption, and global economic cycles have created a system that rewards those who understand money and punishes those who rely on traditional advice. Kiyosaki divides the book into three major parts: understanding the past, navigating the present, and preparing for the future. He shows how the old rules, go to school, get a good job, save money, avoid debt, live frugally, worked in the industrial age but fail in the modern financial environment. Each principle has an opposite that reflects the realities of today's economy. Think like an investor, use good debt, build assets, expand your means, and understand the invisible financial systems driving global markets. The book's core message is that financial intelligence is the new survival skill. Crashes, crises, and economic resets aren't accidents. They're features of a system built on leverage and incentives. Instead of fearing these events, Kiyosaki argues that financially educated individuals can use them as opportunities to acquire assets and strengthen their financial position. Ultimately, Second Chance is not about predicting the future, it's about preparing for it. The second chance comes from learning new skills, adopting new mindsets, and choosing asset-based strategies over wage-based survival. If this breakdown helped you understand the real rules of money, don't stop here. Hit like, subscribe for more financial breakdowns, and drop a comment which chapter hit you the hardest. And if you want deeper summaries of top finance books that actually make you smarter with money, turn on that notification bell. Your financial second chance starts with your next video. Let's build it together.